So as I said, we're going to look at Jonathan tonight. And Jonathan gets sandwiched between his father, King Saul, and David. And we know Jonathan's in there, right? But, so much goes on with Saul and so much goes on with David that Jonathan just kind of gets overlooked, but he's an incredible man of God. He really is. He's a great young man of faith, as we'll see here tonight. And so the first time we see Jonathan's name mentioned in the Old Testament is in 1 Samuel and chapter 14. If you want to turn there, if you have your Bibles, we're going to get to that point in just a moment. But where we are right now in 1 Samuel, according to what I researched and found, we're in the early time of Saul's reign at this point. In chapter 11, you'll see as you read that chapter that Saul is called upon as the new king of Israel to attend to some other Israelites' situation where Ammonites had come in and they had ambushed the town of Jabesh Gilead, and they were threatening to just take this town. And so the elders of the town tried to create a little bit of an opportunity where they could delay this, because the Ammonites said, what we're going to do is we're going to take this town and we're going to gouge out everyone's right eye and we're going to make you subject to us. And so they said, well, if we can just call for help, if you'd give us some time to do that. And so Saul gets the word about this, and it talks about how the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he began to reach out to the other tribes of Israel. In fact, he took an oxen and cut it into 12 pieces and sent it out. And that was a call for the nation of Israel, the tribes of Israel, to join together and come alongside their brothers who were being threatened. And so this is really the first great victory that we see of King Saul at this time, and that's in chapter 11. When we get to chapter 13, we see that this is where things all start to go south for Saul. He's at a place where he's got the troops gathered. They are, let's just read it. It's chapter 13, let's go back there. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. And it says that Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at a location called Michmash in the hill country of Bethel. And 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. And it says that the rest of the men Saul sent back to their homes. So this area is kind of the central hill country in Israel. And I didn't have a picture I could show you. I wish I had. But how many of you seen pictures of the Middle East, and it's just dry and it just all these hills. It's hills upon hills upon hills upon hills. And this is the area and the country that is being referred to here. And so it says that Saul's got these two groups of soldiers, 2,000 with him, 1,000 with his son Jonathan. And so, the Philistines are there in the area, and they're just kind of all in the area. Not much is going on. I guess Jonathan, in his vigorous youth, decides, you know what? We're just sitting here. Nothing's going on. And he stirs up a hornet's nest. And it says in verse 3 that Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. You think they were happy about that? So then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land, and he said, let the Hebrews hear. And so all Israel heard the news that Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become a stench to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Saul's taken the credit. He kind of does that. But it was Jonathan that engaged the Philistines and caused trouble for them. And so all of this is happening in chapter 13. And Saul has been instructed by the prophet Samuel to wait until he arrives, remember, and he's going to offer sacrifices and all of this stuff before they go into battle. And he gets delayed for 7 days. That's a long time to get delayed, right? We get upset when we're waiting 20 minutes because they're taking too long through the fast food drive-through, 7 days he's been waiting. And you know the story. He goes ahead, he offers the sacrifice, he takes the initiative that isn't his to take. And just as he does, as he completes this, guess who arrives on the scene? Good old Samuel, right? Samuel's not impressed. He's not happy. And at this point, through a word of the Lord, through Samuel, Saul is told that the kingdom has now been taken from you because you've been disobedient, you've been rebellious. That's pretty powerful. I mean, he's been raised up to be king, and now Samuel's saying, this is it. God has already found a man after his own heart to take your place. And so that's chapter 13. And so we find at the end of 13, there's kind of a situation going on with Israel and the Philistines. You have to remember that Israel is still a very tribal country. They're not a great united country. They're united, but they're all different tribes and clans, and so there's still a lot of lack of unity, so to speak. And so the Philistines are their neighbors, and they're not very friendly neighbors. They're constantly causing problems for Israel, stirring things up. And it says there at the end of chapter 13 that only the Philistines could handle metalwork and things like that. So Israel had no blacksmiths throughout their whole land. That's significant because if there were no blacksmiths throughout their whole land, they had to go to the Philistines to get all of their farming implements sharpened and things like that. They couldn't begin to build up a collection of arms and weapons and things of that nature. So the Philistines kind of had them under their thumb. And so we see that happening there. It's interesting, the last verse of chapter 13 says, so on the day of battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Now, some scholars say that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but the basic idea is all of these soldiers of Israel are not properly equipped for battle. The Philistines have the latest and the greatest of their day and their time. And so this is kind of an amazing thing right there. But, God's in charge, right? Well, it says, as it opens in chapter 14, that a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. And one day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side. But he did not tell his father. Now, mind you, Jonathan is a leading commander in the army of Saul. And so he sees these Philistines, and he decides to just go check things out. And so it goes on to say that on each side of that pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Senna. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash and the other toward the south toward Geba. Now again, this is all the geography of the area where where the Israelites and the Philistines were and where this battle might take place. And so Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. And here was the response of his armor bearer. Do all that you have in mind. Go ahead. I am with you, heart and soul. That's pretty amazing. Well, it gets even more amazing and almost kind of idiotic when you think about it in terms of, our logic. And so Jonathan said, well, come then, we'll cross over toward the men and let them see us. And if they say to us, wait there until we come to you, We will stay where we are and not go up to them. Now, how many of you have kind of put a fleece out before God before? Okay, this is an interesting fleece, because listen what he says. So if they say, come up here, we'll go up to them. But if they say, stay there, we'll come down to you. If they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So it's like, what? So if they say, stay there, we'll come to you. Or if they say, come up to us, that'll be the sign that God's going to give them into our hands, right? That's just insane. What normal people think like that. But he says, so both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they're hiding in. The men in the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. That's just crazy. So they say, come up to him. So this rocky terrain, if you saw the pictures, it'd be like these rocky rolling hills with these deep canyons. So they've got to go down and then climb back up to where the Philistines are. And they're not using, rock climbing equipment. Their hands, their feet, they've got what weapons they do have with them, and they're doing all of this, and they get up to the top, and interestingly enough, look what happens. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. And Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, his armor bearer right behind him. And the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. And in that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area about half of an acre. Crazy story, right? I mean, I would have a little bit different fleece. I would want a different kind of sign from God than that. That's just crazy. But is it? Because Jonathan was a young man who apparently knew who God was. He'd been raised up in a Hebrew family. He knew the history. He'd heard the stories. He believed them. He believed the stories about his God, Israel's God. And so here he is in this moment. And I think the reason it sounds so crazy is because he had already determined, I'm going to put myself out there and see what God will do, because God can do whatever he wants, whether it's just with me or us or a bunch of us, right? That's incredible faith. It's incredible faith. So we see there, if you want to fill your first blank in, one of the characteristics of Jonathan is that he had faith in God, or he trusted God. You guys know this verse, I'm sure, Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. Do you think that applies here in Jonathan's situation and his action, right? He didn't know what the outcome was going to be on a human level, but he knew whose God he was serving. 2 Corinthians 5:7 says that we walk or we live by faith, not by sight. So it mentions his armor bearer. And probably a lot of you know what an armor bearer is and what they do, but let me just give you a description. So an armor bearer was a personal servant who carried the additional weapons of commanders in Israel's armies and, of course, other armies of other countries. So they would carry these additional weapons. They'd be in battle with their commanders and with their masters. And one of the duties they had was to kill the wounded that were left behind by their master's hand-to-hand combat. Now, I know this is gross, it's gruesome, but this is what happened. So while the commanders threw, it says, heavy javelins, and they shot the arrows, the armor bearers would use clubs and swords to finish off the wounded that were left behind. So this is what the armor bearer did, and this is what Jonathan's armor bearer did. And we see that. It says that he followed behind Jonathan, and he killed the men that Jonathan left behind. What's amazing to me in verse 6, Jonathan says, perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Perhaps. How many of you would risk action like that on a perhaps, right? But Jonathan did. Jonathan did, because I believe that he really knew who his God was. And when we really know who our God is, even perhapses can lead us into seeing God do great things through us if we will be willing to step out, right? I had a pastor that I worked under many years ago tell me that you can't steer a parked car. So in other words, be in motion, be in movement, okay? I believe that God's a forgiving God. If I prayed and sought the Lord about something and I really feel strongly about it, I'm going to step out and take action in what I believe God is doing. Now, I may not have it all right, but God can correct me in the process, right? I'd rather do that than sit back and wait for that perfect moment that we all wait for, that God's really not going to provide because he wants us to step out in faith. So Jonathan possessed an active faith, not a passive faith. In other words, he didn't just sit back and wait for God to do something. He stepped out in faith, knowing that God was capable, what God was capable of, and what God may do through him. You know, a faith built on the knowledge of who Yahweh was is what Jonathan possessed. He knew that God was a mighty deliverer. He'd heard the stories from his childhood. He knew that God was all-powerful, that God was the promise keeper, that God was the great restorer, that he was the Lord our peace, and that he was the God of Israel. That's who God was to Jonathan. The next blank is this: sound faith is built on the knowledge of who God is and his eternal qualities. Sound faith is built on the knowledge of who God is and his eternal qualities. So Jonathan was a young man of faith. He trusted God. That was the first characteristic. The second one, I think it's pretty easy to spot after this narrative that we just read. He's brave, right? He's courageous. Webster says that brave is having or showing mental or moral strength to face danger, fear, or difficulty. Having or showing courage. Here's the next thing. Courage is not the absence of fear in the face of danger. It is choosing to act in spite of the fear or unknown outcome. That's courage. You know, when I was a kid, I thought people that were courageous had no fear. They have fear. They keep going. That's right, Adam. They keep going. So Jonathan and his armor bearer showed incredible bravery by being willing to engage the Philistines and then doing it, right? You know, another word that comes to mind that fits with this is risk taker. How many of you are risk takers? Not a whole lot in the room. Okay, there's some. Risk taking is scary, right? It doesn't have guaranteed outcomes. That's the problem with risk taking. But Jonathan and his armor bearer were risk takers. A risk taker, according to Webster, is a person who's willing to do things that involve danger or risk in order to achieve a goal. Jonathan's goal was not to defeat the Philistines per se. Jonathan's goal was to glorify God. And if that meant defeating the Philistines, poor Philistines, right? In this encounter, in this storyline, the Israelites are shrinking back in fear. They're staying disengaged from the Philistines. And while that's happening, the Philistines continue harassing Israel. And it mentions that they send out 3 raiding parties in different directions in order to inflict damages and cause fear among the Israelites. And I'm sure that it was working. Things weren't looking good for the Israelites at this point. And guess what? Jonathan decided to make something happen. believing that God would rise up on Israel's behalf to defeat the enemy. Hadn't Yahweh done that in the past? Right? Remember the story of the Red Sea and Moses? They're pinned between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army bearing in on them. And what happens? God delivers them, a great deliverance. In fact, it's a foundational deliverance that God created for Israel, because throughout Israel's history, God keeps pointing back to that event. It was so powerful, and God wanted it to be ingrained in their minds. Jonathan, I'm sure, was aware of the Red Sea incident. What about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, right? There was no way this bunch of Israelites could take on Jericho with these incredibly high walls, and it was an incredible fortress. And then God says, what? March around the city. Do that once a day for 6 days, and on the seventh day, march around it 7 times. And then give a loud shout and blow the trumpets. Now, what kind of military plan is that, right? But God wanted them to do something that seemed ridiculous in human eyes so that he would receive all the glory out of it. I think Jonathan might have had that in the back of his head somewhere. What about Gideon defeating the Midianites? God had raised up Gideon at a time where their enemies were overwhelming them. And God raises up Gideon, and in that situation, there's an army that gathers with him, a pretty strong army, but God says, there's too many of you. Need to get rid of some. Whoever's afraid can go home. 2/3 of them disappear. And then God says, no, there's still too many. Take them down, have them get a drink of water. And there were 300 that knelt on their knees, scooped the water, and drank it out of their hands. And God said, those are the ones, 300. And we're going to take on the Midianites? I mean, the Bible says that they're without number out there. Why did God do that? So that God would receive the glory. I think Jonathan might have remembered that incredible story. What about the story of Samson and the things that he did to defeat the Philistine in Judges 13-16? What we're getting at is the fact that Jonathan was a young man who was brave and courageous. And from what I could see, Adam asked me before class started how old he might have been. From what I could research, they say he was only around 20. He wasn't, this. At this point in the storyline in Samuel, okay? So crazy goes to the young, right? He was crazy, but he was crazy for God, and he got results because he trusted God. Another characteristic is he inspired. He knew how to influence, or he had the ability to influence. Number 3, inspire. The ability to inspire others opens doors to influencing others. If you want to be an influencer, learn how to inspire first. John Maxwell, a Christian leadership guru for many, many years, in a book he wrote back in the 90s, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, says this about the law of influence. He says that leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. So if you claim to be a leader and you don't have much influence, according to Maxwell, you might not really be a leader, right? You're the guy that's running down the street saying, I don't know where all my followers are, because they're on ahead of you. But that's not how Jonathan was. Maxwell says the real leaders develop followers not because of their title, but because they positively influence others' lives, making people want to follow them. Have you ever been around a leader like that or a person like that? It might have been that that person didn't even see themselves as a leader, but they had that potential and that ability within them. And I believe that's the kind of man that Jonathan was. And notice how Jonathan's armor bearer responds in the story. He says, do all that you have in mind. Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul. That deserves a wow, right? I mean, can you imagine being that armor bearer who's probably younger than Jonathan? And he's like, you mean we're supposed to go over there to the Philistines? And if they say to come up to them, we got to climb up there, and that's the sign that God's going to deliver them into our hands? Okay. I'm with your heart and soul, basically, is what he says, right? Incredible. Incredible. He says, we are one in heart and mind. I am with you every step of the way, no matter what happens. Can you imagine having someone united with you to the point of death and how powerful that is? Jonathan must have been a tremendously inspiring leader to produce such a high level of loyalty. Here's something for your fill in the blanks. I want you to get them all because I'm one of those guys that can't stand it if I don't get them all, right? Okay. So, inspiration is a pathway to influencing others, especially when it's built on trusting relationships. Inspiration is a pathway to influencing others, especially when it's built on trusting relationships. The fourth quality we see in Jonathan is over in chapter 18, so you have to flip a few pages on down the line. And this is right somewhere after David comes on the scene, and we know the story about David and Goliath. I'm not going to waste time and go into all of that. But David has just defeated Goliath, and it says he did what he promised he would do to Goliath. He says, I'm going to kill you for the glory of God, and I'm going to cut your head off. I mean, wow, okay. And David does it. And it says afterwards he's carrying around the head of Goliath. He even goes into the presence of Saul with the head of Goliath, and Jonathan's there, right? I know it's gross, but, you know, the Old Testament gets pretty, whoo, man. And so that's what's going on there at the beginning in 17. And so in chapter 18, it says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David. Say, one in spirit. He became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And from that day, Saul kept David from him and did not let him return to his father's house. Verse 3, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. We hear that twice now in the span of a few verses. And to show this, Jonathan, in verse 4, took off the robe he was wearing. He gave it to David along with his tunic, which is the undergarment that they would wear with their normal clothing, kind of like a long robe. And he even gave him his sword, his bow, and his belt. I mean, that's a pretty powerful covenant that he's making with David. So as we read through, we hear about the story of David and Goliath, and we come to this point where David meets Saul and Jonathan. And David's probably met Jonathan in the past, because we read earlier that at one point David was somehow brought into the king's presence to play the flute and the harp and to help calm Saul because he had this troubling spirit that would bother him. But at this point, Jonathan sees him, and there's something different about David at this point. And does the spirit of David here remind you of anyone that we've been talking about already? It reminds me of Jonathan, right? What we just read about in chapter 14 with Jonathan and his armor bearer go and take out all these Philistines. There was probably about 20 of them that they took out. And out of that situation, we didn't read that far, the Philistines went into a panic and they began killing each other. And it was such a tumultuous situation that Israel in the distance began to see this. The soldiers who had gone into hiding, the soldiers who had left the area, all somehow began to see this because, remember, the geography of that area, you can see a long distance out there. And they all start to get involved in the battle. And Saul comes, and out of that, Israel has a tremendous victory. And so, to me, when I see Jonathan standing there, and he's looking at David holding the head of the Philistine giant Goliath, and he's probably witnessed what David did with just a sling and a stone. He's going, man, I like this guy. He's like me. He's got the heart of a warrior. He's also someone who trusts God. Because remember, David wasn't trying to take any glory for himself through what he did with Goliath. He was offended that the Philistines and that Goliath was calling curses about God. I'm going to take you out, you filthy Philistine. It was basically David's attitude. And so he takes Goliath out. After spending some time with David in the presence of his father, King Saul, Jonathan experienced a quick bonding with this young shepherd. And it says in verse 1, he became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. So what we see here is that the text reveals a fast and sudden, deep connection that Jonathan has with David. It's not just some casual meeting where, it was nice to meet David after being introduced to him, but rather Jonathan feels this powerful kinship with David. It's like two like-minded, like-hearted individuals who discover a oneness that runs extremely deep. And we read that Jonathan made a covenant with David. So the Hebrew word for covenant is berit, and it's a covenant between two parties that bonds them together as one entity. The 1901 Jewish Encyclopedia says, the primitive way of concluding a covenant was for the covenanters to cut into each other's arm and suck the blood, the mixing of blood rendering them brothers of the covenant. I know, that's pretty gross. But they also used animals, and they didn't suck the blood of the animals. But covenant means to cut. It was a serious thing. And often the covenant wasn't just between two individuals, but it was between their entire families, could even be between clans, even nations. So Jonathan's covenant with David was between the house of Jonathan and the house of David, binding them through the generations to follow. See, I think somehow Jonathan was aware of what God was going to do through David. He must have somehow heard that David was going to be the successor, which doesn't make sense logically in the way men do things, right? And yet, we don't see Jonathan upset about it. We don't see him trying to buck the system. We don't see him trying to, resolve it on his own. His dad's trying to do that. Saul's trying to do that. The text says that the impetus behind the covenant with David is because Jonathan loved him as himself. He loved him as himself. And he gives him these personal items. So these weren't just personal items, but together these items represent who Jonathan was as the king's son, as a leader in the nation, as a great warrior. And to give them to David was solidifying their oneness in brotherhood. A couple of other characteristics we see in chapter 19, that Jonathan was a loyal friend. A loyal friend. The word loyal means unswerving in allegiance. Unswerving in allegiance. And we see that Jonathan, between his father and David, he's caught between two allegiances. But being a man of integrity, Jonathan intervenes to protect David from his father's wrong intentions, because Saul is jealous of David. He wants to take him out. He knows that David is threatening his position as king as well as his royal family line. And so Saul's jealousy of David is overwhelming him. It's causing him to act with murderous thoughts of killing David. And as a loyal friend to David, Jonathan pleads with his father. He pulls him aside, and he pleads on David's behalf. And so we see again this quality, this characteristic within Jonathan, that he's an influencer, because the outcome is a positive one. He convinces his father not to follow through with his intentions of killing David. Now we know he doesn't stick to it, but still, Jonathan was an influencer. And he convinces his dad that killing David would be an unjust course of action. So Saul relents from his decision, and he actually swears an oath not to harm David. Although we know he doesn't uphold it. So beware of people like that. The last characteristic that I want to identify with Jonathan is that he was humble. He was humble. In his deep friendship with Jonathan, and eventually David became one of the family because he married one of Saul's daughters. But Jonathan accepted the call of God on David's life. That meant that what his future should have been would be no more. This is the kind of thing that people get really upset about and jealous over, like Saul did. Jonathan had been a close-up witness to his father's pride and insecurities, and he had seen how that had negatively affected Saul's leadership. Jonathan was a different kind of man than his dad. And in spite of Jonathan's position as next in line for the throne, he accepts the call of God on David as the next king of Israel. But he not only accepts it, he encourages David to remain strong and hopeful in the fulfillment of God's plans. And that's what we see in 1 Samuel 23, verses 16 to 18. We see this is the last time it's recorded in Samuel where the two of them were together. And it says that, let's see. Give me just a second. I want to make sure I'm reading the right scriptures. And it says here in chapter 23, verse 16, and Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. And he said, don't be afraid. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. That's a deep friendship. People kill each other over power, and there's a lot of power in this story. But Jonathan is a man who is humble. He's not here to push himself and his agenda like a lot of people. He knows what God's plan is, and he's at peace with it. He's at peace with it, to the point that he is encouraging David to stay strong. Talk about a loyal friend. There's not many people who possess that kind of grace and humility. Proverbs 11:2 says, and this is a fill in the blank, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. Proverbs 29:23 also says, pride belongs to a person low, but the lowly in spirit gain honor. And of course, Proverbs 3:5 and 6, one of my favorite verses, trust in the Lord and lean not on your own what? Understanding. In all of your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. This is Jonathan. These are some of the characteristics that we see as we read about his life. And so, he's an exemplary young man. We see in 1 Samuel 31, that's where Saul and Jonathan and some of the other sons of Saul fall together and die in a battle. And that kind of brings a conclusion. And out of the covenant that Jonathan and David made, there was a son that was left behind, Mephibosheth. And in time, David honors his covenant with Jonathan and finds Mephibosheth and brings him into his home and seats him at his table so that he would eat at the king's table every day. You have to understand, in these days when people rose up into kingly positions, their first steps were to take out all of their competition, whether it was family or other people in the hierarchy of leadership. But David didn't do that. He held to his promise. Pretty amazing. So, well, thank you. There's some continuing things here that for the next maybe 20 minutes or so. You can take some time as a table and talk about. Did we get all the fill in the blanks? What did we not get? 4 and 5. Okay. What did you figure out? Yes, I'm sorry. I did not say that. I apologize. That's it. That's it. I apologize. I skipped over that. Let me go back and find it on my notes. Yeah. I missed all of 4? Oh my goodness. All right, I'm never teaching here again. Okay, number 4 was identify. What Jonathan did is he identified a young leader, and he drew him in. And Jonathan obviously believed in being someone that multiplied leadership. Great leaders don't set out to be a leader. They set out to make a difference. It's never about the role. It's always about the goal. Correct. I apologize. Thanks for catching that. Of unswerving in allegiance. Thank you, class. We're all doing this together. I love that. I do. I really do. What was more questions?
What was
The first point under faith in God, the fill in the blank, was Jonathan possessed an active faith, not a passive faith. So, all right, are we good? So if you take a little bit of time and just look at those questions and give that some thought, maybe have some discussion around the table.